There's often a lot of conversation about swatching as you get into garment knitting. A swatch is simply a sample of the project that you're about to knit. And there are several reasons to swatch. You want to find out if you like the way that your yarn is knitting up. If you're using more than one color, do you like the way that the colors are playing together? Is there enough contrast in your color work yarn choices? If you're knitting a textured pattern, does the yarn that you're using show up off the texture, or does it mask it? Do you like the way a variegated yarn knits up? Do you like the drape or the density of the fabric? Is it too stiff? Is it too loose for the particular project that you're going to make? And of course, the big reason for swatching, according to me, is what needles should I use to get gauge? Do I like the fabric at the pattern gauge? And will my sweater fit? So what I'm going to attempt to show you is how I gauge swatch. And I do have pretty good success at getting my garments to fit. The pattern will give you the suggested needle size, and it really is only a suggestion. But it's a good starting place for your swatch. If you know that you're a very tight knitter, you might want to start your gauge swatch on a needle one size up. If you are a loose knitter, you might want to start your gauge on a smaller needle. I get the question a lot of times, do I need to swatch? And sarcastically, my answer is only if you want your garment to fit. But in reality, the answer is no. You don't always have to swatch. If you're knitting a small project like a hat, a pair of mittens, a pair of socks, you can use your actual garment, your actual project for your gauge swatch. After you get knitting for a little while, go ahead and take a ruler and count how many stitches you're getting in a couple of inches or 4 inches, and you'll be able to tell if you're going to be close. If you're knitting something that doesn't require a fit, it still is a good idea once your project is started. You don't need to make a separate gauge swatch usually, unless you're looking for color play or something like that. But you can, once you get going again, take a measurement of your gauge swatch and be aware of it. The pattern is written and the material amounts are given for a certain gauge. If your gauge is significantly larger, then you may run out of yarn. If your gauge is significantly smaller, then your shawl or cowl or whatever might be significantly smaller than what you're expecting. So gauge is important to keep in mind. However, for a sweater, which is a larger project, you've spent quite a bit of money on the yarn, you're going to be investing a lot of time into the sweater, the gauge swatch will definitely increase the certainty that you will get a garment that fits. How do you do your swatch? Well, this is how I do it. I usually, here's a gauge swatch that I have just finished. I take the expected gauge. So for example, if I am if I'm expecting to knit my sweater to a gauge of 20 stitches for 4 inches, I will cast on my needle I'm a pretty average knitter, so I'll generally start with the needle size that's given in the pattern. And I will cast on the 20 stitches plus 8 to 10 extra stitches so that I can get a measurable area of 4 inches by 4 inches in the gauge. Actually more than 4 inches. I probably want a 5 by 5 square. You can have a little border if you want. I don't always put one on. It does make your unwashed or unblocked swatch lay a little flatter if you put a little garter stitch border. Don't use rib because that pulls it in. You want to be able to take a 4-inch measurement on your normal, regular, even stitches. So the larger your gauge swatch, the more accurate your swatch is, more accurate your gauge is going to be. When you are knitting your swatch, you want to make sure that you are using the same exact conditions as you are when you're knitting your project. So use the same exact needles for your swatch, the same exact yarn. If your garment is knit in the round, then your swatch should be knit in the round. If you're making a cardigan and it's knit in pieces, then you're going to be knitting your swatch flat, where you have a purl back row or a wrong side row. You want to knit kind of under the same conditions. Don't be so kind of tense or maybe excited to get started. Calm down, have a cup of tea, something, and knit your swatch calmly till you get into kind of the same rhythm you get when you're knitting your swatch. Once you're finished, you can either bind off at the top, or sometimes I will cut the yarn with a fairly large tail and I will thread my yarn through the live stitches at the top of the gauge swatch. This will help me especially if I have a patterned stitch like this. It will help me if the pattern kind of obscures the stitches, and I will count out my stitches and then measure down that column, and I'll be able to measure my swatch a little bit better. You do want to knit your excuse me. You do want to knit your swatch with the same pattern as the body of your garment. Here I have a couple of swatches just to show you swatch on different size needles. One is significantly larger than the other, and so I can check the drape or the feel of the yarn, whether it's too large or too open. You may need to swatch to do more than one swatch if you're way off in your original gauge swatch. Here's a swatch that I've done on 3 different needle sizes, and I've just connected them all. You can do them separate or you can keep them all on one. I have shown what needle I'm using here, and I don't know that you'll be able to see it real well, by doing a series of purl stitches to represent the needle size. On this swatch, I have, not on that swatch, on this swatch, I have done a yarn over, knit 2 together to leave little holes to represent this was knit on a size 5 needle. Another thing that you can do is if you just have used one needle size on a swatch, you can tie little knots in the cast-on tail, each knot representing the size of a needle. This one was knit on a size 6 because there are 6 little knots on the tail. So you may need to make one make an extra swatch if your first swatch is way off or you're just not happy with the fabric. Once you've completed your swatch, you will want to measure your gauge, then block, and be sure to write down your gauge, both your stitch gauge and your row gauge. Write it down. I like to write it right down on my pattern so I don't lose it. Then I'm going to soak this, and I'm going to soak it the same way that I'm going to take care of my garment. If I'm going to wash it with eucalyptus or a wool wash, I'll put that in my water as I am soaking this. I will soak this for about a half an hour. I'll roll it in a towel to squeeze out any extra moisture, and then I'll simply lay it out flat to dry. When it's completely dry, then I will measure it again for my finished gauge, and that's the one that you want to match to the pattern. And in the next video, I'll show you how to measure that gauge. Once you've made your swatch, it's time to find your gauge, both for the number of stitches and the number of rows. Whether you've knit your swatch in the round or flat, you lay your swatch on a flat surface, something stable, and smooth it out. This is kind of rolled up a little bit, and that's typical. This has not yet been blocked, but you can see I've made a swatch that's over 5 inches wide, so I have plenty of room to measure my gauge. Typically, patterns give you the gauge per 4 inches, the number of stitches per 4 inches, or the number of rows for 4 inches. The larger your measurement area is, the more accurate your gauge will be. Some patterns will give you the number of stitches per inch. In that case, that just divide your 4-inch count by 4. But generally, you're given a 4-inch gauge. You will want to take your measurement where your stitches are most regular, usually in the center of the swatch. Come in from the edges a bit. You can see I've done that. And you want just a basic regular stitch. If you're knitting with a yarn that's somewhat irregular, so that your stitches do vary in size, you might want to take a couple of measurements, one a little more towards the top or a little more towards the left, and then a little down, and then take an average of those. There are 2 ways that you can figure your gauge. One of them is by marking off a certain area and counting a certain measurement and counting the stitches within that measurement. Here I've used 4 inches, and that's pretty typical. Don't go smaller than that, or like I said, the larger the area, the better your gauge will be, the more accurate it will be. If you have an extremely large swatch, go ahead and measure the number of stitches per 5 or 6 inches. You'll get a more accurate gauge that way. To compare, you just need to bring it down to stitches per inch. So the first way is to mark off your measurement and then count the stitches. Be sure to include any partial stitches. Here I have measured off 4 inches, and I'm using a fixed ruler. That's a little bit more accurate than, it has less chance of slipping and that sort of thing. A tape measure is a little harder to hold still. And then simply count your stitches. I'm looking for the little V's. So I have a V here, a V here. I find it very helpful to have something in my hand so that I can kind of tick off each stitch. So my gauge for this would be 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, 18, and here I have a partial stitch. 19 would be over here, 18 and a half would be here. I'm going to call this 18 and a quarter stitches per 4 inches. And write that down. So 18 and 1/4 or 18.25 stitches per 4 inches. I like to write that right on my pattern so I don't lose it. The row count is done exactly the same way. Take your measurement in the middle of the swatch, mark off your 4 inches. I like to put a pin in. Start right at the top of a stitch. Go to 4 inches. This looks like it's going to be an even stitch count. Okay, so this is my rows. I, again, like to use something and actually kind of lift up. Here's the point of my V. Here's the start of my stitch. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, 18, 19, 20, 21, 22, 23, 24. So 24 rows per 4 inches. Again, write that down. Now this swatch has not been blocked. What I would do now, after I get my gauge, is to soak my swatch for a half an hour, roll it in a towel, wring out, or to get out the excess water, lay it flat, smooth it out, let it dry completely, and then do the same thing over again. Again, write those figures down for your after washed or after soaked gauge, because that's the final, that's what your garment is going to end up being. You want to know the unblocked or unsoaked gauge and the after soaking gauge. When you're knitting along, you'll want to check every once in a while to see if you're still knitting to that same gauge, and that would be your pre-wash measurement. But when you do your size figuring to make the correct size for you, you'll want to use the after blocking or after soaking measurements. Now, I told you there's a second way to measure your gauge. And what you can do is just mark, or you can count off stitches. So I'm going to start at the same place. And my gauge was close to 18. So I'm going to count off 19 stitches. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, 18, 19. And I'm going to mark that spot right there. That's 19 stitches, 19 V's I counted off. Now what I'm going to do is measure that exactly, and I get, for those 19 stitches, I get 4 3/16 4 3/16 inches. What I would do then, and it's helpful to have a calculator, is figure out what the decimal equivalent of 3/16 of an inch is, and I would divide the number of stitches by the measurement to get my stitches per inch. To compare that for a 4-inch swatch, you simply multiply it by 4. And you can do the same thing for row gauge. That's kind of helpful if you're having trouble estimating a partial stitch, or you have some sort of pattern and you, as you can see, I've left the top of this. I didn't bind it off. I simply ran my working yarn. I cut it and ran it through the stitches at the top. If this were kind of a pattern that made counting the stitches difficult, I would look at the top, I would follow that row down, I would count off a certain number of stitches, follow that down, mark it, measure it, and do my division there to get an accurate stitch count. So it does come in helpful. The first way that I explained is usually certainly fine for most cases. And that pretty much tells you how to measure your swatch.